A billionaire's dream wedding conceals lies and power plays. One brave bride may shatter the script and rewrite their fate tonight. Behind opulence at a billionaire's wedding lurk deception and broken trust. A love built on dangerous secrets threatens to explode. When a billionaire stages love as strategy, his bride uncovers buried truths. One reveal may topple everything he built in silence. Glamour, power, and betrayal collide at a staged wedding. One crack in glass could expose an empire of lies for all to see tonight. The story begins with the glittering skyline of Manhattan shimmering against the velvet backdrop of night, each tower blazing with life, ambition, and secrets. In the heart of this world, where fortunes are made and destroyed with the flick of a signature, lived Alexander Grant, a man who seemed to have everything. Alexander was not just a billionaire. He was the very embodiment of wealth, influence, and allure. His name was whispered at charity galas, splashed across magazine covers, and envied by rivals who longed for the effortless way he commanded attention. With his tailored suits, oceanfront penthouses, and an empire built on real estate and luxury investments, he had crafted an image so pristine that no one dared question it. But behind the glass towers and private jets, Alexander was weaving something far more delicate and dangerous than the public could ever imagine. A love story built on lies. A fairy tale wedding staged not for love, but for power and control. The world had first learned of Alexander's engagement to Charlotte Hayes 6 months before the summer of the wedding. Charlotte was no ordinary fiancée. She was breathtaking, with a kind of beauty that seemed pulled from a painting, hazel eyes that could soften even the hardest of hearts, golden hair that flowed like silk, and a voice that carried both warmth and confidence. To the public, she was the perfect match for Alexander, an heiress from a prominent Southern family whose legacy stretched back generations. When news outlets broke the story, it became the event of the year, a union between two dynasties that promised to reshape the social hierarchy of the elite. Invitations to the wedding were rumored to be the most coveted tickets in the country, with billionaires, senators, film stars, and royalty all vying for a seat in what was being described as a once-in-a-lifetime celebration. But while the media gushed over the love story, whispers began to circle in darker corners. Some said Charlotte wasn't who she claimed to be, that her wealth had evaporated years ago in a string of bad investments. Others hinted that Alexander's empire, though vast, was built on shaky foundations, sustained by illusions rather than indestructible wealth. None of these whispers were loud enough to break through the gleaming surface of their carefully orchestrated narrative, but they lingered like shadows at the edge of the spotlight, threatening to unravel everything at the worst possible moment. Charlotte, for her part, had been swept into Alexander's world like a moth drawn to flame. When they first met at an art auction in Los Angeles, she had felt the gravity of his presence the moment he walked into the room. He didn't just buy art. He owned the air in the gallery. His confidence was intoxicating, his attention magnetic. To Charlotte, who had been raised in a world where appearances were everything but security was fleeting, Alexander represented a fortress, an escape from financial strain, a guarantee of a life where she would never again have to worry about being left behind. Yet as much as she wanted to believe in the fairy tale, she knew the truth in her bones. Alexander's proposal had been less about passion and more about strategy. He had told her plainly one evening, while pouring champagne in his penthouse overlooking Central Park, "We could be unstoppable together. People believe in what they see, and what they will see is us. Perfect, unbreakable." And so began a carefully choreographed engagement that would capture the world. Every dinner outing was photographed, every trip abroad chronicled in glossy magazines, every gesture between them scrutinized for signs of eternal devotion. To the outside world, Alexander and Charlotte were in love, but inside their relationship, both were actors playing roles written by Alexander's vision. He was determined to host a wedding so lavish it would eclipse even royal ceremonies. And in doing so, he would silence his critics, attract new investors, and remind the world that his empire was not only alive, but expanding. The months leading up to the wedding were a blur of fittings, tastings, and secret deals. Alexander secured a private island off the coast of Florida as the venue, an Eden reserved for billionaires and world leaders. He spared no expense, flying in architects to construct a glass cathedral that seemed to float above the ocean, with marble imported from Italy and chandeliers crafted from hand-blown Murano glass. No detail was too small, no extravagance too indulgent. The guest list swelled to include names that dominated industries: tech titans, oil magnates, fashion icons, all eager to be part of the spectacle. For Alexander, the wedding was less a union of love than a financial summit, a stage where every smile and every toast would serve as a contract, every whispered conversation a negotiation sealed by champagne. Charlotte, however, felt the weight of the life pressing against her chest each night as she tried to sleep. She wanted to believe Alexander loved her, that behind the calculating eyes there was a man who saw her not as an accessory but as a partner. Yet, every conversation about the wedding seemed to circle back to power. "Do you know what they'll say when they see you walking down that aisle?" Alexander asked her once, his tone laced with triumph. "They'll say I've built something so beautiful that even perfection wanted to marry me. That's the story, Charlotte. That's the truth they'll believe." His words stung, but she nodded, because in Alexander's world, hesitation was weakness. Behind the scenes, secrets grew like cracks in glass. Charlotte had her own past to hide: debts, failed ventures, a string of relationships that ended in betrayal. She feared that if anyone uncovered the truth, the empire Alexander had promised her would vanish before it even began. But Alexander's secrets ran deeper, darker. His empire was not as invincible as it seemed. Several of his luxury developments had stalled, investors were demanding answers, and regulators were circling like sharks sensing blood. The fake wedding was his masterstroke, a grand illusion to distract, to convince the world that everything was thriving. By the time the first toast was raised at the reception, Alexander believed he would have secured enough deals to keep his empire afloat for years. Love, in his equation, was expendable. As the day drew nearer, the pressure mounted. The island buzzed with preparations as private jets ferried in shipments of rare flowers from Holland, vintage wines from France, and musicians who had sold out stadiums around the world. Paparazzi camped outside Manhattan skyscrapers, capturing every glimpse of Charlotte in her couture gowns. Fashion bloggers analyzed her every accessory, speculating on the designers behind them. Alexander, always in control, orchestrated each scene like a director shooting the greatest film of his career. But even directors can't control everything. There were moments, small, fleeting, that revealed the fractures beneath the surface. Charlotte's eyes clouded during interviews when reporters asked about how they fell in love. Alexander's smile tightened when journalists pressed for details about his latest business ventures. To the untrained eye, it was nothing. To those who watched closely, it was everything. And then came the rehearsal dinner. On the eve of the wedding, in a candlelit ballroom with a view of the sea, Charlotte stood in front of family, friends, and the powerful elite who had gathered early. She raised her glass, her voice trembling as she spoke of love, trust, and forever. Alexander watched her closely, every word calculated against the backdrop of his grand strategy. But as Charlotte spoke, she locked eyes with him, and for the first time, he saw something he hadn't expected: doubt. Not fear, not nerves. Doubt. It was the look of a woman questioning not just the man beside her, but the very foundation of the story they were selling. Alexander clenched his jaw, raised his own glass, and smiled for the cameras. But in that instant, He knew the wedding was no longer just about illusion. It had become a battle for control, a war between truth and deception, one that neither of them could win without sacrifice. The morning of the wedding arrived like a tidal wave, unstoppable and overwhelming. The island gleamed under a sun that seemed almost too bright, as if mocking the secrets hidden beneath the satin and marble. Guests arrived in waves of designer gowns and tuxedos, stepping off yachts and helicopters into a world built for spectacle. The glass cathedral sparkled like a jewel against the horizon, a palace built on lies and ambition. Inside her private suite, Charlotte sat before a mirror, her gown cascading around her like liquid light. Makeup artists and stylists buzzed around her, perfecting every detail for the cameras that would broadcast her image to the world. Yet, as she stared at her reflection, she whispered to herself, "Who are you really, Charlotte?" And for the first time, she wasn't sure of the answer. Alexander, dressed in a tuxedo custom made by one of Europe's most exclusive tailors, stood outside the cathedral, greeting dignitaries and magnates with a smile that hid the storm inside him. His phone buzzed constantly. Messages from lawyers, updates from accountants, reminders from his team, but he silenced them all. Today was about the performance, and he would not let reality disrupt the play. As he shook hands, laughed at jokes, and posed for photographs, his eyes scanned the horizon, searching for the woman who held the key to everything. He needed Charlotte to walk down that aisle, to play her part, to cement the illusion. Without her, the empire would crumble. The music began, the glass doors opened, and the world held its breath as Charlotte stepped into view. Cameras flashed, gasps echoed, and Alexander felt the weight of victory pressing against his chest. Yet, as Charlotte walked toward him, her steps steady but her eyes unreadable, he realized the truth he had avoided for months. He could control the flowers, the music, the guests, even the headlines, but he could not control her heart. And in that moment, as the sun bathed the glass cathedral in golden light, the billionaire's fake wedding teetered on the edge of collapse, waiting for one whispered truth to bring it all crashing down. The golden light streaming through the glass cathedral made the air shimmer with unreality, as if the entire event were being staged on another planet. The guests, draped in designer couture, leaned forward in their seats, their eyes locked on Charlotte as she glided down the aisle. The orchestra swelled with a melody composed specifically for this moment, a blend of timeless romance and cinematic triumph. Every step Charlotte took echoed not only in the polished marble floor beneath her heels, but also in the heartbeats of millions, who would watch this wedding later on television, in glossy magazine spreads, and across endless streams of social media posts. Alexander smiled as he watched her approach, but the smile was not one of love. It was one of calculation. For him, this was the deal of a lifetime, and Charlotte was both the jewel of the crown and the final piece of the puzzle. Yet as he locked eyes with her, he could sense something dangerous stirring beneath her practiced composure. He had orchestrated everything down to the second. But what if she chose this moment to rewrite the script? Charlotte's mind was a storm beneath the veil. As she drew closer to Alexander, her gaze swept across the sea of faces. The senators, the billionaires, the movie stars, the tycoons of technology and finance. They all expected a spectacle, a fairy tale, a merging of power and beauty that would solidify Alexander's image as untouchable. But Charlotte knew something none of them did. For weeks, she had been receiving messages from an anonymous source. At first, they seemed like the work of a gossip columnist fishing for dirt. But as the days passed, the details became sharper, more precise. Copies of financial statements, emails, contracts that revealed the rot beneath Alexander's empire. Deals that had never closed. Properties valued at billions, but mortgaged into oblivion. Shell companies funneling money into accounts that didn't exist. And then came the most devastating revelation. Alexander had chosen her not simply for her beauty, not for her family name, but because she, too, had secrets that could be weaponized. He knew about her debts, about the failed ventures her father had tried to cover up before his death, about the broken trust funds. She was, in many ways, as fragile as his empire. Their marriage was not just a partnership, it was mutually assured destruction. The officiant's voice rang out, warm and commanding, a steadying presence in the cathedral. "We gather here today to witness the union of Alexander Grant and Charlotte Hayes." The guests smiled, nodded, some dabbing tears from their eyes, as if they were already part of history being made. Alexander reached for Charlotte's hand, his grip firm, his eyes locking hers with silent command. "Stay the course." She let him take her hand, but the doubt inside her deepened. This wasn't a wedding. This was theater. And she had to decide, in front of the world, whether she would continue playing her role or bring the entire production crashing down. The ceremony unfolded with rehearsed perfection. Vows were exchanged, rings slipped onto fingers, and cameras caught every glimmer of diamond, every tremor in their voices. But when it came time for Charlotte to speak her vows, the cathedral fell silent. She looked at Alexander, at the guests, at the endless sea of expectant faces. Her voice quivered as she began. "Alexander, when I met you, I thought I had found a man who could see me. Not just the name, not just the appearances, but the real me. I thought you were someone who understood what it meant to feel fragile, to feel like the ground could collapse beneath your feet at any moment. But standing here today, I realize that what we've built together isn't a foundation. It's a stage." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Alexander's jaw tightened, but he held his smile, squeezing her hand just hard enough to leave an impression. Charlotte paused, her heart racing. This was her moment to choose. And in that pause, she chose silence over rebellion. She ended her vows with softer, safer words, ones that preserved the illusion. "And yet, I promise that as long as we are walking this stage together, I will play my part." Applause erupted, the tension diffused, and Alexander exhaled. She hadn't destroyed him, not yet. The reception that followed was a carnival of wealth. Fireworks lit the sky above the island as champagne flowed like water. Guests danced beneath chandeliers that seemed to glow from within. The world's most famous singers performed private sets, their voices carrying across the waves. Alexander moved from table to table like a king, his laughter loud, his charm undeniable. For him, this was victory, proof that he could orchestrate not just markets, but hearts, headlines, and history itself. But Charlotte, seated at the head table with her new husband, felt the cage closing in. Every toast, every compliment, every whispered congratulations was a reminder that she had just tethered herself to a man whose empire was a house of cards. She excused herself, slipping away into the shadows of the cathedral, her gown trailing like a ghost behind her. It was there, in the quiet of a marble hallway, that she was approached by the man who had been sending her the messages. He was dressed in a simple suit, his face nondescript enough to blend in among the staff, but his eyes burned with intensity. "You don't know me," he said quickly, his voice low, "but I know everything about him. And I know everything about you." He pressed a small envelope into her hand. "You can save yourself, Charlotte, or you can go down with him. The choice is yours." Before she could respond, he disappeared into the maze of corridors, leaving her clutching the envelope as if it were a live wire. Inside the envelope were documents, contracts showing Alexander's latest deal collapsing, accounts drained, investors preparing lawsuits. But what caught her breath was a letter addressed to her in Alexander's handwriting. It was dated months before they met. In it, he detailed how he needed a bride from a prominent family, someone whose public image could offset his crumbling reputation. He had even listed candidates, with Charlotte's name circled at the top. She wasn't chosen out of love or even convenience. She was chosen like a pawn on a chessboard. And now she was trapped in his game. The days after the wedding were a blur of headlines and photographs, each more dazzling than the last. "The wedding of the century," declared one. "The billionaire and the heiress rewrite history," said another. Social media erupted with envy and admiration. Yet beneath the glamour, the cracks widened. Lawsuits began to surface. Journalists started digging deeper,